Stepmom and Dad took their daughter on vacation, leaving me behind. They thought I'd just sit and wait. But I had other plans. Plans they'd never see coming. They left early in the morning. I watched from the window as their car disappeared down the road, their laughter still echoing in my ears. No would-be. No second glance. I stood there gripping the edge of the curtain, my heart pounding. Not with sadness, not even with anger. With something colder. They thought I was powerless. They thought I'd just stay here forgotten. But they were wrong. By the time they reached their destination, their vacation paradise would turn into something else entirely. Because I had made sure of it. The first sign came on their second day. A call from home. No one on the other end. Just heavy breathing. Then click. They probably thought it was a mistake. A bat signal. But it wasn't. The second sign. The pictures on their phone started changing. The family selfies they took on the beach. One by one, an unfamiliar shadow began appearing in the background. Closer each time. By the fourth day, my stepmom barely slept. My dad brushed it off. But deep down he felt it too. The unease. The creeping sense that something was off. And then on the fifth night, their daughter woke up screaming. "There's someone in the room," she sobbed. They turned on the lights. No one there. But the closet door was open, just a crack. And on the mirror, written in smeared red letters, "You left me behind." Their bags dropped to the floor with a dull thud. My stepmom gasped, clutching my dad's arm. Their daughter, their perfect daughter, hid behind them, her wide eyes filled with terror. "How?" my dad whispered. "You were supposed to be here. You never left." I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch, watching the fear settle in their bones. "Oh, I never left," I said softly. "But neither did you." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" I stepped forward. Just one step. Just enough to make them flinch. "Tell me, Dad," I said. "Did you really make it back home?" Confusion flickered across his face. My stepmom's breath hitched. The little girl clung to her mother's waist. The air in the room shifted. Heavier. Colder. Then my dad's phone rang. He jumped, fumbling to pull it out of his pocket. He glanced at the screen. "Home." He looked up at me, then at the house around him, his hands trembling. That's impossible." The ringing continued. Relentless. Deafening. I smiled. "Go ahead," I said. "Answer it." He hesitated, then slowly pressed the button, bringing the phone to his ear. "Achille." For a moment silence. Then his own voice echoed back at him. Raw, panicked, desperate. "You have to leave. Now. This isn't real. You never made it back." The line went dead. My dad staggered backward, his face drained of all color. My stepmom grabbed his arm, shaking. "What is this?" she cried. I took another step closer, my smile widening. "This," I whispered, "is what it feels like to be left behind." The lights flickered. The walls seemed to pulse. And in the reflection of the hallway mirror, behind my family's trembling figures, was me, still standing there, still smiling. And then, the lights went out. They checked out of the hotel that night, cutting their trip short. Rushed back home, shaking, exhausted. The house was dark when they arrived. Silent. But as my dad flicked on the lights, his face went pale. Because standing in the middle of the living room was me. Smiling. "Welcome back." Darkness swallowed the room. My stepmom let out a sharp gasp, grabbing my dad's arm in a death grip. The little girl whimpered, pressing her face into her mother's side. "Dad," she whispered. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Because none of them did. A second passed. Then another. The only sound was their ragged breathing. Then in the pitch-black silence the phone rang again. Ring. The same number. Home. My dad fumbled with it, his fingers shaking as he lifted it to his ear. He put it on speaker. A low, distorted version of his own voice crackled through the speaker. "You should have never left her." My stepmom choked on a sob. My dad's breath came out ragged. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Coming from the hallway behind them. The little girl whimpered. "Daddy." My dad spun around, his eyes wide. But there was nothing. Just an empty hallway stretching into darkness. Another step. Closer this time. And then, The TV flickered on by itself, bathing the room in eerie gray static. My stepmom flinched, her nails digging into my dad's arm. On the screen, a security feed appeared. For blurry frames. The front yard. The back door. The upstairs hallway. The living room. This living room. The feed was grainy black and white. The time in the corner flashed midnight. Then the image in the last frame, the one showing the living room, changed. A shadowy figure stood in the center of the room. Motionless. My dad's breath hitched. My stepmom covered her mouth. Then, in real time right in front of them, the figure on the screen tilted its head. Exactly as I had done moments ago. The little girl let out a strangled scream. My stepmom yanked her back, stumbling away from the TV. Who is that?" she shrieked. But deep down they already knew. The figure on the screen took a step forward. And at the same time, a whisper brushed against their ears. Not from the TV. Not from the phone. From behind them. "Welcome home." The lights flickered back on. And I was standing right there. Right in front of them. No longer across the room. No longer a distant shadow. Just inches away. Close enough to touch. Close enough to see the horror in their eyes. I smiled. "What's wrong?" I whispered. "You left me behind. But I never left you." My stepmom screamed. My dad grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the front door, dragging their daughter along. But the door wouldn't open. The locks twisted, the handle refused to budge. "No, no, no," my dad muttered, yanking at it desperately. "This isn't real." I tilted my head again, watching them. "Real?" I echoed. "You're sure you ever made it back?" I lifted my hand. Just slightly. The walls trembled. The floorboards groaned. And behind them the mirror reflected something wrong. They weren't alone. Their reflection stood there. But there were more figures now. Twisted, shadowy versions of themselves. Eyes hollow, mouths stretched in silent screams. The little girl turned and saw it first. She let out a blood-curdling shriek. And in the mirror, their reflections moved on their own. Their mirror selves reached out. Stepmom. Dad. Their daughter. The shadows grabbed them and yanked them inside. The screaming stopped. The house fell silent. The lights flickered once. Twice. Then steadied. The TV powered off. And in the mirror the reflection was normal again. Empty. The house was empty. The only one left standing there was me. Alone. Just like before. Just like they had left me. The house was silent now, empty except for me. The door stood wide open, but there was no sign of them. No bats, no footsteps, nothing. Just the mirror, its glass now smooth and untouched, reflecting only the quiet room behind me. I stepped forward, placing my palm against the cold surface, and for a moment I swore I felt something on the other side. A whisper, a breath, a presence. Then slowly I smiled. They had left me behind once, but now I had ensured they would never leave again. As I turned away from the mirror, the house seemed different. The air was lighter, the walls no longer pressing in. It was as if the house itself had sighed in relief, finally rid of them. I walked through the empty rooms, running my fingers along the dusty furniture, listening to the faint echoes of a family that no longer existed. Their absence wasn't just physical. It was complete, like they had never truly been here at all. And yet, deep down I knew the truth. They were still here, trapped, watching, waiting. And as I sat down in my father's old chair, staring into the quiet darkness, I whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, "Now we're even." A faint creak echoed through the house, soft, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. A whisper of movement in the walls, a presence lingering just beyond sight. They were gone, not completely. I could feel them, pressing against the edges of reality, trapped in a place they couldn't escape. I leaned back in my father's chair, tracing patterns into the worn armrest, the silence stretching between us. Could they still see me? Could they still feel what I had done? A slow smile crept onto my lips as I glanced back at the mirror. Its surface now dark, hollow. Good. Let them watch. Let them understand what it meant to be forgotten. To scream with no voice. To reach for help that would never come. They left me behind once, but now I would never be alone again. The house settled around me, the wood groaning as if breathing in the quiet. Shadows stretched along the walls, shifting in ways that didn't match the light. I could almost hear them, Muffled whispers, desperate scratching just beyond reach, the frantic rustling of something unseen. They were trying to get out. Trying to undo what had already been done. I stood slowly, walking back to the mirror, tilting my head as I studied my reflection. But this time it wasn't just me. Behind the glass, distorted and twisted, my stepmom's hollow eyes stared back, wide with terror. My father's mouth was open in a silent scream, his fists pounding uselessly against the invisible barrier. The little girl clung to them, her face frozen in a silent, endless sob. "You feel it now, don't you?" I murmured, pressing my fingers against the glass. The surface rippled under my touch, the images behind it distorting, warping. They wanted out. They begged for it. But there was no mercy left in me. "No one came for me," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "No one heard me. No one saved me." Their hands slammed against the other side. Frenzied now, their mouths moving in soundless pleas. My stepmom's lips formed a single word. "Please." I smiled. "No." And with that I turned away, leaving them behind. Forever. As I walked away, their pounding grew more frantic, the mirror shaking violently as if the glass itself was trying to shatter. But it wouldn't. It never would. This prison was permanent. Their desperate faces would remain trapped in that frozen abyss. Their screams lost in the silence between worlds. I made sure of it. The house felt lighter now, no more tension. No more weight pressing on my chest. Just stillness. Peace. Meaning. I ran my fingers along the walls, humming softly to myself, listening to the echoes of a home that no longer belonged to them. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, flickering the lights. From the mirror, a faint whisper curled into the air, barely audible. My name. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see their reflections out of the corner of my eye. My father's face was twisted with rage, my stepmother's hands still pressed against the glass. But the little girl, she wasn't crying anymore. She was watching me. Just watching. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned fully, stepping closer, my breath steady but my fingers tightening into fists. Something was wrong. She tilted her head the exact same way I did. And then slowly, with a small knowing smile, she raised her hand and waved. I froze. The little girl's hand pressed flat against the other side of the mirror. Her fingers splayed, her expression eerily calm. The others, my father, my stepmom, were still frantic, pounding, screaming in silence. But she wasn't. She just stood there, watching me, mimicking me. A strange pressure filled the air, thick and suffocating, like the moment before a storm. My pulse pounded in my ears. Something about the way she moved, the way her dark eyes locked onto mine, it wasn't fear. It wasn't even pleading. It was understanding. My throat tightened. "What?" I whispered, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. She followed my movement exactly. One step. Another. A perfect reflection. Then crack. A tiny fracture splintered across the glass between us, thin as a hairline. My heart lurched. No. That's not possible. The mirror doesn't break. The little girl's lips parted. She didn't speak, but I heard her. Not alone anymore. A second crack shot across the mirror. "Wait." My voice came out hoarse, uncertain. My fingers twitched at my sides. I wasn't sure if I wanted to reach out or back away. She tilted her head again. That same slow, unnatural movement. And then, she stepped forward. Not her reflection. Her. Through the mirror. The glass rippled around her like water as she crawled out, her small hands pressing onto my floor, her bare feet landing silently on the wooden boards. She rose to her full height, small, fragile looking. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Behind her, the others were still trapped. Still screaming. Still pounding on the other side. She turned to glance back at them, then slowly faced me again. And smiled. "Now it's your turn." A cold, invisible force yanked me backward. I barely had time to scream before I was dragged into the mirror. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was her standing in my place. Perfectly still. Perfectly calm. Like she had always belonged. And as I slammed against the cold, unyielding glass, I realized I was the one left behind now. The world on the other side blurred, twisting and warping like melted film. My stepmom and dad were still screaming, pounding their fists against the barrier. But their voices were fading, distant. Their daughter, no me, just stood there staring. She tilted her head, just as I always did. She was me now. I clawed at the glass, my breath coming in ragged gasps. No, no. Let me out. My voice came back to me in a warped, distorted echo. The glass was smooth, solid. No way through. She lifted her hand and pressed it against the mirror, on my side now. A perfect copy of what I had done just moments before. But there was no fear in her eyes. No panique. Just quiet satisfaction. I shook my head frantically, slamming my fists against the glass. Who are you? What are you? That's my life. She smiled. A small knowing smile. Not anymore. And then she turned away. No. I screamed, hammering against the glass. Come back. You can't do this. This is my house. My revenge. My life. But she didn't even glance back. She just walked step by step, away from the mirror, away from me, until she disappeared into the house. I spun, my breath heaving. The cold realization settled deep in my bones. I was inside now. Inside the mirror. And behind me, a movement. Slow shuffling. I turned, and my breath froze in my throat. The figures were still here. My father. My stepmom. The twisted, shadowy versions of them that had been trapped long before me. Their hollow eyes bore into mine, their mouths open in silent wails. Their hands reached out. I stumbled back, slamming against the glass. No, stay away. But the little girl's voice whispered in my mind. Not alone anymore. The mirror behind me shimmered, sealing shut. The shadows surged forward. And this time, I was the one screaming. But no one could hear me. No one ever would. The last thing I saw was my own reflection, fading into darkness as the shadows swallowed me whole. And in the world beyond the glass, the little girl, the new me, sat down in my father's chair, humming softly to herself. The house was hers now, and she was never alone. Time didn't feel the same here. There were no hours, no sunlight, nothing but the sound of my own breathing echoing in the emptiness. I was no longer standing before the mirror. Now it was behind me, smooth, unbroken, as if it had never cracked. I turned, pressing my hands against the cold surface, trying again to push through. But the glass didn't give. It was like there was no glass at all. Just a solid wall between worlds, keeping me locked away. I rested my forehead against it, feeling the icy chill seep into my skin. On the other side, the room remained unchanged. My father's chair. The phone that would never ring again. The mirror reflected everything exactly as it was. Everything except me. Instead I saw her. Me. She was sitting in my father's chair, reclining lazily, like she had lived here forever. Her fingers drummed lightly against the wooden armrest. Her posture easy, familiar. Too familiar. Every movement, every little gesture. She was becoming me. My teeth clenched. I slammed my fist against the glass. Once. Twice. The surface didn't so much as tremble. I screamed, shouted, begged, but no sound passed through. Only I could hear my own voice, swallowed by the endless void around me. Then she finally looked up. Her eyes met mine, and something cold and heavy coiled around my ribs. She saw me, and not just saw, understood me. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Then she lifted a hand and placed it against the mirror on her side. Her fingers traced the glass exactly where mine were. And for a brief moment, I swore I could feel warmth again. But it wasn't my skin anymore. It was hers. She straightened her shoulders, exhaled, and slowly rose from the chair. Every movement was effortless, like she had always belonged here. She walked to the window, glancing outside. In the reflection of the glass I saw her face, my face. But when she turned back toward me, something in her eyes was different. Something deeper. Something wrong. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. What did you do? I whispered, though I knew she couldn't hear me. But she could. And she answered without words. She simply tilted her head. The same way I always did when I looked at them. And my father. And my stepmother. At the little girl who was no longer me. This is my life now. I went still. She moved away from the mirror, leaving me behind. I wanted to scream, to pound on the glass again, to get out, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, watching as she walked, brushing her fingers over the furniture, trailing them along the old wooden table, passing by the hallway mirror where her reflection was no longer mine. She reached the front door and stopped, turned back one last time, smiled, and opened it. Light from outside flooded the house. I felt the ground beneath me tremble. Then she stepped out and never looked back. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and just like that she was gone. I stood frozen, my palms still pressed against the cold glass, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The world beyond the mirror felt distant now, like a dream slipping through my fingers. The house was the same, the furniture untouched, the air still, but it wasn't my world anymore, because I wasn't in it. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see behind me, and there they were. Shadows. Twisted figures lingering in the dimness, their hollow eyes locked onto me. My father. My stepmother. Their reflections. The versions I had trapped here before. They loomed in the darkness, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching. I stumbled back against the mirror, heart hammering against my ribs. No. No, 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 stay away from me. But they didn't stop. And then I understood. I wasn't just with them now. I was one of them. The cold, creeping dread settled into my bones, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. The reality of it clawed at me, burrowing into my skull. This was my prison now. I had been so consumed with revenge, so focused on making them feel what I had felt, that I never considered what came next. And now there was no way out. The mirror behind me shimmered, sealing shut, trapping me as it had trapped the others. I let out a shuddering breath, my fingers curling into fists. The figures in the dark didn't move any closer. They just stood there watching, waiting, because they knew the truth. She had taken my place, and I had taken theirs. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, sharp, bitter, wrong. I turned back to the mirror one last time, my reflection barely visible in the dim light. Not my real reflection. Not anymore. And then from somewhere deep in the house I heard it. A faint sound. Soft. Innocent. Coming. She was singing. My song. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred. She was living my life. She was walking in my skin. And no one would ever know the difference. My father. My stepmother. The world outside. They would never question it. Because as far as they knew, I had never been replaced. I pressed my forehead to the glass, my breath fogging up the surface. And then I whispered, my voice lost in the void. I was supposed to win. The darkness pressed in closer. And from the other side of the mirror, she smiled. I staggered away from the mirror, my breath shallow, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to undo this, to fight back. But there was no waking up. Non-bling. No fight left to win. This was real. This was forever. The shadows around me stirred, shifting closer. Their hollow faces stretched in endless silence. My father. My stepmother. The little girl I had trapped before. Their eyes, dark, empty voids, burned into me, unblinking, knowing. They had waited for this. For me. And now I understood. They hadn't just been trapped here. They had been consumed by it. By this place. By the mirror. And now so would I. A cold, sick feeling curled in my gut. I turned back toward the glass, desperate. There had to be a way out. I pressed my hands against it, harder this time. Hard enough to break bone if it meant shattering the barrier. Nothing. The world beyond the mirror was still there. Just as I had left it. But it was hers now. She sat at the kitchen table, calmly eating breakfast. My breakfast. She reached for the glass of orange juice, my hand reaching for it exactly as I would have, and took a slow sip, staring at the window. Not a single flicker of doubt in her movements. She had become me, and she wasn't looking back. My stomach twisted into knots, the weight of realization slamming into me like a tidal wave. This had never been about revenge. This was a trade. A cycle. Someone always had to be left behind. And now it was my turn. A scream built in my throat, but before I could let it out, the mirror shuddered. I stumbled backward as a sharp crack splintered across the surface, like ice breaking underfoot. My chest heaved. My pulse pounded. Was it breaking? Was she letting me out? But then I saw her. The new me. She had stopped eating. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her gaze toward the mirror. Toward me. Her eyes met mine. And then she raised her hand. Not to touch the glass. To wave. The exact way the little girl had waved before she pulled me inside. I choked on my breath. No. Crack. Another fracture split the mirror, but this time, it was on my side. I gasped, stepping back. The air suddenly thick, suffocating. The shadows shifted. The darkness behind me moved. Then, a whisper. So close it could have been inside my head. Not alone anymore. I spun around, and the shadows lunged. 1,000 clawed hands reached for me, pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the void. My screams were swallowed before they could leave my throat. I kicked, I thrashed, but it was useless. I was part of it now. Part of the mirror. And just before the last sliver of light vanished, just before the mirror sealed itself forever, I saw her, standing in my world. Smiling. Whole. Real. And as I was pulled into the abyss, as the darkness consumed me completely, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. No one would ever know I was missing. The darkness swallowed me whole. It wasn't just emptiness, it was something else. Something alive. It clung to me, crawled under my skin, pressed into my skull like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to move, but my limbs felt wrong, heavy, stretched too thin. I wasn't falling. I wasn't standing. I was just drifting. And then, I felt them. The others. They were here, just beyond my vision, shifting in the dark. Their presence coiled around me, thick and suffocating, like cold breath against the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I turned, or maybe I didn't. And suddenly I saw them. My father. My stepmother. The girl who was once their daughter. The ones I had left behind in this place. Their faces were barely faces anymore, just hollowed-out versions of who they had been. Their features twisted, blurred at the edges like smeared paint. Their mouths were open in silent screams. Their fingers twitched, reaching, grasping at nothing. They were still trapped. Just like me. A shudder wrapped through my body. If it was even a body anymore. My thoughts felt loose, unsteady, unraveling like thread. Was this how it started? Was this how they had become? Whatever they were now, would I forget too? Would I fade? No. No. I dug my fingers into my palms, at least I thought I did. I needed to hold on to something. Anything. My mind. My name. My reason for being here. The reason I had done this in the first place. I had wanted them to suffer. I had wanted them to feel what it was like to be abandoned, to be left behind. And now I was the one who had been erased. I had won. Hadn't I? A laugh bubbled in my throat, sharp and wrong, twisting into something close to a sob. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I had planned everything. Every phone call. Every shadow in the photos. Every creeping, sinking moment of dread. I had orchestrated their fear down to the last second. But she had planned something too. I could feel it now, the weight of it settling over me like chains. That girl. The new me. She had always been here, waiting just beyond the mirror. Watching. Learning. Until the moment I opened the door. I had thought I was the one in control. I had thought I was the one pulling the strings. But she had been waiting for me to take my place. And I had walked straight into the trap. A sound echoed through the darkness, soft, distant laughter. Not mine. Hers. I stiffened. My pulse, if I still had one, slammed against my ribs. I twisted, searching for the source. But there was only endless, pulsing black. Then, the mirror appeared. It rippled into existence before me. Smooth and glassy, stretching into the void. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't broken. It was whole. And through it, I saw my house. The real house. The world I had been torn from. And her. She stood in my bedroom, gazing at her reflection, at my reflection. Her head tilted just slightly, an unreadable smile on her lips. She was comfortable there. She belonged there. I wasn't getting it back. A choked noise clawed its way out of my throat. I lunged at the mirror, slamming my hands against it, pounding against the glass. Nothing. She didn't react. She just smoothed down her shirt, my shirt, and turned away from the mirror, stepping into my life without hesitation. I felt something crack inside me. I screamed. I screamed so hard my throat should have torn open. But no sound escaped. The mirror didn't so much as shudder. And then, she stopped. Right before walking out of my room, she hesitated. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head back toward the mirror. Toward me. And she winked. A slow, mocking little wink, like she had been in on the joke the entire time. Like I was never meant to win. Then she flipped off the light. The room vanished into darkness, and I was left staring into an empty mirror. No house, no escape, no sign that I had ever existed at all. Just me, and the shadows, waiting, watching. And now, I was one of them. The mirror flickered. For a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw my reflection again. Not the thing I had become. Not the shadow I was now. And me. Whole. Real. Alive. Hope surged in my chest. Was there still a way out? I reached toward the glass, fingers trembling. The surface was no longer smooth. It rippled beneath my touch, like water disturbed by a single drop. My breath hitched. And then, something grabbed my wrist. A cold, clawed hand lunged from the darkness behind me, wrapping around my arm, yanking me back. I thrashed, tried to fight, but more hands shot out, grabbing my shoulders, my legs, pulling me deeper, deeper. No. No, I won't let it end like this. I ticked, twisted, fought with everything I had, but the shadows were too strong. They had been waiting too long. And now they had me. The last thing I saw was the mirror. The glass smoothed over, my reflection vanishing completely. The ripples stilled. The window to my old life closed forever. And then, darkness. Time passed. Or maybe it didn't. I couldn't tell anymore. The darkness wasn't just around me now, it was inside me. It had seeped into every thought, every memory, drowning me in its silent grip. The more I tried to hold on to who I was, the more it slipped through my fingers like sand. My name, my face, my existence, fading, fading, until a whisper, soft, gentle, familiar. Not alone anymore. Something shifted. The darkness trembled. And suddenly I wasn't just lost in it. I was the darkness. The weight pressing against me? It was me now. The whispers in the void? Me. The twisted, forgotten figures that had been here before me? I was one of them. And as the realization settled in, something changed. The mirror appeared again. Not in front of me. Around me. I wasn't looking into it anymore. I was inside it. Waiting. Watching. Just like they had been. Just like she had been. My lips curled into a slow, bitter smile. She thought she had one. She thought she had taken my life, walked away, and left me behind. But she had made the same mistake I did. She thought the mirror was just a prison. She didn't realize it was also a door. And doors? They don't just let people in. They let people out. So I waited. Silent. Patient. Because one day she would come back to the mirror. One day she would look into it and see something wrong. One day she would feel that faint, creeping sense of unease, that whisper of movement in the glass, the shadow that didn't quite match her own. And when she did, I'd be there, waiting for my turn, just like she had waited for hers. If this video hurt you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to those who will understand.